first question, we have several about the revision process and getting students to be comfortable with it and accepting of it. And several people brought up like how you incorporate revision into a composition class. So do you have any advice on that and making it more of a comfortable topic for them?
You know, students fight revision, they all do, but I think that, I mean, one strategy is to sort of, be a little harder on them at the beginning. Of course, you guys all know that, right? So they can see, oh, I didn't revise and I got a grade I don't love. So they become more willing to revise after that, certainly. One thing that I also do with them is I try to make them responsible to the class. And so it may not be possible in a class with, many students, but if you have a smaller section, or maybe you could divide them into groups, but I'll put their paragraph, their introduction and thesis paragraph up on the board. So we'll look at it and we'll project it. And if they haven't done a good job and there's tons of spelling, and I'll make them read it out loud. So they're accountable for the work that they've produced, and it does make them feel a little bit more like, okay, I don't want to look completely ridiculous in front of all my peers, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time with this. That's one thing that I have found works pretty well.
I can definitely attest to putting more effort into something so my peers are going to read it. I like that practice. So I don't know if you do that with every student, but it had a lot of people interested in finding out how you have time to check each individual student's assignments. If you do it in a group setting like that, or if you go through them one by one, having one-on-one conferences, what's your method?
So I actually, at SMU, I do one-on-one conferences with every student. So we do that, we meet individually, I look at their drafts, and I really am kind of hard on them about, what they're doing. Well, like, what does this mean? And this sentence says X, I don't understand what you're trying to say. Or this is the prompt question, and you're not really answering it because your thesis says whatever. So we really try to I try to work with them very individually on that. Now, I know there's some of you who are in schools where you have so many students you wouldn't be able to accomplish that. What I've done before, whenever I used to teach at UNT, which is a large state school, and so what I would do then is I would put them in like teams, and maybe I would have 5 students and I would conference with those students at one time. And so I would sit with them in a small group and we would sort of all be looking at it at the same time, working on it together. And because a lot of the same issues come up over and over again. And so then I would try to read their paragraphs or whatever we were looking at before, so that then I could say, oh, and Fred, you were doing that as well in your paragraph, and kind of connect some dots for them so that they could see, that they were making some of the same mistakes. But I just also really try to hold them very accountable, and call on them a lot and ask them to respond a lot and want them to be responsible for their own writing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, as they should be. So in this time of remote learning, do you have any recommendations for how to hold these writing conferences with students? Any software that you like, or like what methods do you utilize right now?
So I'm teaching remotely right now, actually. So I'm teaching a class on Zoom, and so I'll be there later today at 2. So I'm teaching, and one thing that I really loved is the breakout rooms. And so you can do it a couple of different ways. I've been putting them in small group breakout rooms, even with as few as 3 students or 2 students, and then I'll go to each breakout room and I tell them, like, I'm going to come and harass you about what you're writing about, but in a very nice way, right? So I'll come and make them talk through the idea, and we'll work on it together. But sometimes I'll even put them in breakout rooms by themselves. So then I'll come and visit each room. One thing that I also did, we have a really great librarian. And so if you're fortunate enough at your school to have a really great librarian, that's an amazing resource. And so in the spring, when we went remote, one thing I did a couple of class periods was I had the librarian come with me, and we were just like cycling in and out of all of the breakout rooms on Zoom and talking to the students about the essays and what they were doing. And so when I would come in, they would say, oh, Jonathan was just saying we should do this. What do you think about it? And then we would talk through that idea a little bit more, or what sources they could look at. So I really tried to use that outside help that we have at SMU. And you guys all have librarians, I'm sure. So if you have a good one, utilize that person.
Okay, great advice. Thank you. There's a question and a few comments about any recommendations regarding moving away from a structured 5-paragraph essay. They say students are not good without boundaries, which I can attest to. And that's something that's very different going from middle school setting to high school, where you have those set boundaries and you have them established through standardized testing, to then when you go to a college university setting and it's not there. So do you have any advice on how to help teachers engage students in a way that doesn't establish those boundaries and sets them up for a college setting?
Well, I mean, we all are going to have to learn the 5-paragraph essay format, certainly. Like, it's a skill you need, like I said, to do timed writings, to pass standardized tests, especially in Texas, you need that skill. So I think that it's fine to teach them that, but I think that it can't be like the end all be all. And so maybe while you're looking at that and working on that, then you're also working on and talking about this other format where you're not so structured. I mean, I always tell them it's not that 5 paragraphs is wrong. So the having 5 paragraphs isn't the thing that breaks your essay. It's having those unrelated points. So if you have your paragraphs, if they're all interchangeable and you can just, like I said, willy-nilly move things around in whatever random fashion you want, and your paper still makes sense, then you have a problem, really. So you should be writing a paper that demonstrates a logical progression of thought. I have to understand body paragraph 1 before I can get to body paragraph 2, before I can understand body paragraph 3. So you can do that with 5 paragraphs, certainly, but it's just those unrelated subtopics that become a problem and that really make it hard for them when they go to college to try to figure out what it is, how to move away from that. And I saw someone else in the questions was asking about the length of the paper, and students in college, they still ask me, how many paragraphs should this paper be? And I'm always like, how many paragraphs do you need to explain what you're trying to explain? And so then sometimes that's one thing we'll talk about in the outlining process. So I'll look at their outlines, or, you know, I'll kind of be floating around the room working on that with them. And if I can see, well, you have a pretty complex thesis and you have 2 paragraphs, how are you going to explain these things in 2 paragraphs? You're not really going to be able to do either one of these points justice. I mean, wouldn't you need to break it down in X, Y, and Z way or whatever? So I try to show them that way in that outlining stage. That way they have a plan of how many paragraphs they actually need if they outline first. So it's not so daunting.
Okay, great advice. Thank you. Similar vein of students not knowing how to proceed and being wary of not having boundaries. Students are often really resistant to writing argumentative pieces because they don't want to be wrong. When they're doing creative assignments, there's no right and wrong, but that isn't the case when there's an argument posed. So what are some ways that you push against the need to have for a right and a wrong to exist in this discipline, where their 2 concepts are a little bit muddy maybe?
Yeah, I mean, students, they do struggle with that even at college. And I always tell them there's no right and wrong. Like, it's your opinion, it's not wrong, it's just what you think, right? So you can write any kind of crazy argument, and if it's logical and reasonable, okay, well, it's working as an argument. You know, maybe I don't agree with your idea, but I don't have to agree with your idea. If you're writing it well and you're being very reasonable and very logical, that's why I always stop them when they start saying, oh, well, I got a B or a C because my teacher didn't agree with me. And I'm like, no, it doesn't matter what I think or if I agree with you or not. It's really how well you're arguing. And if you're not arguing your point well, then it just, like I said, the dog won't hunt. It can't work. So you have to really, I guess, encourage them to feel confident enough that there is no right and wrong. Like their opinion is okay as long as they can assert their ideas and do it well.
Great advice. Yeah, a professor once told me, your idea is right if you convince me it is.
Right, exactly. I think that's a nice way of saying it.
Yeah. Another question, so about tone. Why do you think students are so familiar with tone? How can we use that with purpose? And just balancing author's tone and their own tone in their writing and working with that.
I think that they're just familiar with tone because they've all had that moment where they got a text from a friend and they were like, oh, my friend is mad at me or talking to me kind of in a sassy way all of a sudden. And then they realized later it wasn't, because they misinterpreted the tone. So they're sensitive to issues of tone because it's happened to them, just because they communicate in these weird like social media messaging ways now. So that's happened. They've all had an incident. Every time I ask them, like, have you ever had this happen? They really all respond like, yes. And so I'll ask them to tell me about it, talk about it. Why, what happened? What, you know, what was the tone? What were the weird things that were said, or how was it? How were you reading it? And so I really try to get them to think about that. I mean, in terms of tone and purpose, I think that they have to mostly consider what type of tone the audience would need to hear, right? I mean, because if you're not considering your audience when you're crafting your document, there's a definite problem. You're going to have some issues. And the whole purpose for writing is to address your audience in some fashion, right? So they have to be kind of logical and reasonable and trustworthy in their tone and consider their audience.
Okay, wonderful. A little bit different, but there's a question about finding balance between having students include their voice and having a formulaic essay. So a question of, do you have any tips, suggestions for helping students make their essays their own while still meeting the assignment expectations?
Well, I mean, I tell them your idea is your own. And they always think that, like, if I ask a question that every single person in the class is going to write the exact same thing. And they'll say to me like, oh, I'm sure you're tired of reading the same thing over and over again. And I'm like, no, you guys are all writing different things. And so, I mean, you can even do things to kind of show them that, like ask them to write their opinion on something, like just what's your opinion about whatever. They all have different opinions. And so they really all have that, voice and that different opinion. You just kind of have to encourage them to use it. So that's.
Do you have any advice on how to get reluctant writers to do that, to express themselves, to maybe go against the grain, what their classmates are thinking?
Well, I'm going to talk to you guys about that a little bit in the second session, because I have some assignments to show you that will help them sort of move through the process of like getting to be an argumentative writer, because I don't think you can just go into a classroom, especially a high school or middle school classroom, and just say, okay, we're writing an argumentative essay, everyone, start working on your thesis statements. I think you kind of have to like sneak up on them with it and like slowly move into it so that eventually you are writing or you are addressing, you know, argument and bringing them to argumentation kind of slowly, to get them there.
Okay, so we'll save that for later. Another question regarding putting a thesis at the end of the intro. With middle schoolers, the teacher states that they tend to make them state their thesis statement first in order to focus their energy and keep on track. Is the thesis statement placement a matter of choice or in style, or is there one better way to do it than another? What do you prefer?
I think that's a good question. I think that it depends on how complex your thesis is. I can see that at the middle school level, you might be writing a paper that with that level of student that isn't so complex that you need to sort of first explain it. I think that then it could work to have it first. But I think if it were me, what I would do is maybe we start with it first and you tell them, okay, we're starting with it first because we're working into more complex ideas. And as we get there, we have to sort of move it down because you need to have some explanation. And I always tell them, what would your mom need to hear before you tell her this thesis? Because like no one cares about what they're writing about besides me and their mom, right? So I always ask them, like, what does your mom need to hear before she hears this thesis? What would you have to say to her? And that's really what they should be doing in those steps in the intro, is setting up the reader to understand this complex idea. But if you're starting out with something really simple, I can see that maybe you start from the beginning and do it a little bit differently. I would just try to move them to something more complex where it was at the end and needed some setup, personally.
Okay, makes sense. What about the teaching style of having students like come up with a thesis but really not refine it until after they've written a portion of their essay? So you come back to it and that's where you fill in the thesis part and really solidify it.
I think you can do that. I mean, I've done that before with students. I'm not opposed to it. The only problem that I see with that is sometimes it frustrates them because, as we talked about, students are resistant and hesitant to revise. So once they write something, they feel like it's very beautiful and they're very committed to it and they don't want to change it. And so then if they do it where they've written, you know, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then they go back and try to create the thesis, sometimes it's hard because they realize they've written these like completely random paragraphs about things that they can't connect. And then they have to like completely cut some of them out, which if you have a student who's okay with that, I mean, maybe that could even be a way that you teach argumentation or revision, is to show them, okay, let me go back and now I don't need this paragraph. I'm going to let it go. It's okay. It's kind of like I also studied art in college, and I remember on my first painting class, we worked for like a week on this painting, and then at the end of that week, the professor made us tear it up. It was so painful. So we had to tear it into little shreds, and he was like, "You're not married to your work." And so I still kind of remember that in terms of revision. Students definitely feel very married to it. And sometimes if they get too far into it and have to go back and start from scratch, it's upsetting to them. But I do think it's a good revision, a good lesson on revision. And one thing that I've seen that using that technique, it'd be really useful. One way I've seen it be really useful is to show them how important it is to outline before. Because then they realize like, oh, I actually would have known this if I had clarified my topic and really made my point clear from the beginning. I would have known where to go instead of just like put some paragraphs together randomly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's very helpful. Thanks. Do you want students to integrate ethos, logos, and pathos when writing an argumentative piece? How do you teach those portions of writing?
It's like you guys know what I'm about to talk about.
Okay. We can save that for later then if you want.
Well, I am going to talk about that next. I don't incorporate that in every argument. Like sometimes we talk about it, and I usually always try to cover it with them at some point and talk about it in some way during the semester. And we'll usually, like right now in my class, we're writing a paper using ethos, pathos, logos. But we don't do that. We won't do that again in the semester. So I do think it's useful to approach it at one point in one type of assignment, but not in every single one.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we'll touch on that later. How do you feel about having teacher or professor writing an argumentative essay for the students about why writing matters as part of the like I do statement?
I think that's a great idea. I also think, I mean, students respond really well to other students writing. And so one thing I've done for a few years is I'll give them the first day of class a diagnostic essay, and I'll ask them some question to write on some question. It's kind of simple. We do it in class. It's a timed writing. And, you know, I tell them, okay, you're going to try to write an argument, do the best you can. We haven't talked about all of these elements of argument yet, so just do the best you can. And then a few weeks into the class, I will pull up some of those paragraphs, like the body paragraphs or the introductions and the thesis statements after we've talked about it. And then they're like, oh, I see that this isn't really working. They really, it works very well to see other student writing, and especially their own writing from the past. I think a teacher writing an essay as an example is a great idea. I've done that before when I didn't have maybe a really amazing student example of an introduction. I've just like written one myself. And yes, I think that can work also, especially if you write a really nice model that you can like show them the points that you're going over with them in that model. I think that's great.
Perfect. We have a couple questions about teaching writing and its relation to STAR. So I'm going to try to combine them. Hopefully it'll work. One of them is about using the quote that's provided to them in a test prompt. And so wondering if they should use the quote or not. I don't know how familiar you are with STAR exams. I assume that means there's a quote that they need to write about or elaborate on. Do you feel like that's necessary to include a quote in a prompt, or how would you tackle that?
Sometimes I do include a quote, certainly. I mean, especially if I want them to, like, you know, as that example, it's a good and a timed writing. Maybe I'll ask them, I'll pull a certain passage or a quote and ask them like, what's happening here? Or something specific about the quote. And then if I'm understanding the question right, I think then, yeah, if the student wanted to, especially if it's maybe like a few sentences, if the student wants to break down sections of that quote and really analyze it in the paper, I think that's totally fine and a good strategy for, you know, writing a successful paper.
Okay, great. And you touched on the timed writing aspect. There's a question about moving from 8th grade where STAR is really focused on timed writing. How do you get students to come out of that mentality and just get away from that a little bit?
You know, I think that is hard. I think that what you have to do is just start doing it, you know, start moving them beyond it. Maybe you can even start with a timed writing exercise and then kind of start working slowly. Okay, let's now write a paragraph. And that is how I would probably start, like very small steps outside of that to get them going and get them interested. I do think you have to like interest them. I always say you sort of have to meet students where they are. So if they're stuck in timed writing, okay, let's start with timed writing and then let's move beyond that. Let's look at something different. Let's take it in small pieces and take small steps towards something new.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. We have a couple questions about closing an essay and writing the conclusion. Do you have any, you mentioned a couple like guiding questions on how to close an essay. Do you have any advice on writing the conclusion, getting students to be okay with that and finding their closure in the argument, not being super summative? What guiding principles do you like to adhere to?
So the questions that I was mentioning was really to just think about like, what did I learn, like as the student? What did the student learn? What might others learn from this argument? How is it relevant today? What are the far-reaching implications of the material and why does the idea matter? I really try to ask the students that a lot. Why does this idea matter? If you can't tell me why it matters, then I'm not sure why you're writing it. And the conclusion, I mean, I'm still fighting the summary battle at the college level with the conclusion. So we're still working on that. They certainly want to rely on it very much. I think that you can do, one thing I've done is like take a short essay that maybe a student from the previous semester wrote that was a strong one and take off the conclusion. And then, okay, let's write a new conclusion here and like sort of challenge them to think about like read through the essay, how would you finish this? There's so many ways. I mean, I also talked to them about if you're making, for example, we were just working on a paper where they were reading some articles about poverty and the issues of poverty in America. And so I was saying, you could really end this paper very nicely by almost like a call to action. What happens if we don't make a change in these circumstances in terms of the argument that you're making here? You're saying something very negative is happening, but like, what do we do next? Are there next steps that could fix this? Or is there something that we could do that maybe you could leave the reader with here that would motivate them? So I guess sort of thinking of it that way is helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. I think that's kind of how I was taught, and I appreciated that. We have a question about just motivating students in general. This one pertains to students with learning disabilities, but I think it could be part of a broader conversation with discussing the writing process and helping students not be discouraged by it, because writing is a very difficult thing and it takes a lot of practice to get right and become good at. So do you have any just general guiding principles that you like to start off a semester with or echo throughout a semester to encourage students to keep up their good work and not lose hope?
Yeah, I mean, they do get discouraged. I think that's one thing students, for whatever reason, students often feel like I was saying, that they write something, it's really lovely and they don't need to change anything. And then they're like shocked when you tell them that it's not lovely. So I think that sometimes is a little bit of a sting. And so I try to be aware of that. If I have a student who's especially sensitive to it, then I'll even call the student in to come in and talk to me outside of class, and we'll sort of talk through the grade or the paper, and I'll let the student know, like, hey, I think that you're really smart and you're really capable of doing a lot of great things. We need to work on these things, and let me help you do that. And so, I might even give a particular student a certain assignment based on the essay. So like, for example, if I read an essay and I see that paragraph 2 was just completely disorganized and whatever, I might write it in the comments, like, for your homework, you need to revise paragraph 2. And then when they do, I try to be really encouraging, of course, if it's good, but usually they can revise it, right? And so I'll try to be encouraging and say, oh yeah, this is so much better. And just, I guess, offer some encouragement that way. But I do think it helps if you can just even pull a student aside outside of class and say, hey, I know that maybe you're not completely happy with your grade on that paper, but like, you can totally do better. Like, just a lot of encouragement, even individually.
Okay, wonderful. Question about plagiarism and how you handle that. I know it's a little different at the university level than in high school and middle school, but do you have any advice on how to handle that, how to check for it? It's a very time-consuming process to go through and do it yourself. So what words of wisdom do you have regarding that?
Plagiarism, trying to find it yourself is like completely exhausting. So I really do feel for you if you're having to do that. I would encourage you, if your school system can afford it, to get some program like turnitin.com. That's what we use at SMU. I always tell the students, you can probably fool me with a plagiarized paper. I mean, I can't search the entire internet, but you can't fool turnitin.com. And so I'll even pull up an essay and we'll look at one together. Of course, I remove the name and everything and show them how sensitive that program is. I mean, it will pull like 3 words together from a website and then show you what website it came from. And so I guess I sort of start that way from the beginning, showing them that example, but also just talking about intellectual property and how people, especially at the university level, get very upset when their intellectual property is stolen. And so how can we try to avoid that and not be victims and fall into that? At the college level, the kind of interesting thing that often surprises them is that accidental plagiarism is still considered plagiarism. So I always talk to them about, oversighting and rather than underciting, and if they're on the fence about something, put the citation in. So we do spend time talking about it, and I do show them the system that we're using, and like I said, I would recommend that system if your school is able to get it, because it makes your life so much easier.
Yeah, definitely. There's a comment made that the Google Classroom itself has some features that allow for checking, just like turnitin.com. So that's a good resource if you guys are going to be using that this coming semester. But the scare tactic of what it will do to you in college, that definitely works too. It's no joke. So that is pretty much all the time that we have.